Part 18. The Hub. Pescadero State Hospital, 10:45 p.m. The black and white photograph was a nightmare image from the past. A surveillance camera still frame that showed blurry forms of cops frozen in the emergency lights of a burning corridor. A black-clad figure stood at the end of the corridor. He had short cropped hair and dark glasses, an AR-180 assault rifle in one hand and a 12-gauge in the other, holding them both like toy pistols. Another photo was slapped on top of the first, the same angle, a moment later, showing the figure standing very near the surveillance camera. Detective Weatherby pondered the images with weary eyes. It was a bitch of an unsolved case. An entire night shift of cops killed or injured by one gunman. They had never found him. Weatherby had lost a friend that night, but he wasn't on this case for personal reasons. He was out to stop a cop killer, and he had to rely on this poor woman's obviously fragile memory to help him do it. He looked up at Sarah Connor and said, "These were taken at the Rampart Division, West Highland Police Station, back in 1984. You were there." They were in the examination room Sarah had been dragged out of hours ago. She looked at the stack of photos that Weatherby had tossed on the table in front of her. She looked up at the detective. It was not a kind face, but it was not a particularly cruel one either. He was just doing his job. His partner, Detective Mossberg, an unassuming man with ill-fitting clothes and bad teeth, sat across from her. Sitting beside them all was a watchful Dr. Silberman, trying unsuccessfully to sublimate his irritation. Two uniformed cops stood by the door, flanking Douglas, who didn't even try to disguise his irritation. Sarah stared listlessly at the top photo, which featured her. She looked like the day she'd been having. "He killed 17 police officers that night. Do you recognize him?" Weatherby slapped another black and white 8x10 on the table, a close-up of a bloody Terminator rising up from a pile of glass, surrounded by an astonished crowd. Of course, it wore the same face. This one was taken in a mall in the valley. Today. Sarah said and did nothing. She just looked down at the photograph and breathed. From the outside, she looked like a typical, drugged, high-security basket case. From the inside, she was straining to maintain control in the face of an enormous desire to flip over the table, smash it into Silberman's face, then crash through Douglas and the cops at the door, then race down the hall and burst through the security doors and out into the parking lot and hotwire a car. But it couldn't happen that way, so she just sat there, hoping it would happen the other way, the way she was now piecing together as she looked down at something next to the photos. Weatherby broke the moment of silence. "Miss Connor, your son's missing. His foster parents have been murdered, and we know this guy is involved." Sarah looked up at him, a cold and empty expression, and said nothing. Weatherby scowled and said, "Talk to us." She had been in a few junior high school plays. Her drama teacher, Mrs. Kolb, would have been delighted by her performance here. "Don't you care?" Evidently not, by the wall of indifference she showed him. Weatherby glanced at Silberman, then his partner, and shrugged. "Guess this wasn't such a good idea. Come on, we're wasting our time." One of the uniformed cops opened the door, and Mossberg strode into the hall. Weatherby and the two uniforms followed him out, with Silberman right behind. That supercilious tone had returned to his voice as he said, "Sorry, gentlemen." Sarah slumped under the bright overhead light. She knew Douglas was watching her, so she moved her hand almost as slowly as the minute hand on a clock, creeping along the edge of the table towards the stack of photos. She slipped off the paperclip binding the stills together and hid it between her fingers, just as Douglas lifted her up by the arm and led her out. In her cell, Douglas cinched up the last of Sarah's restraints, then leaned over her, studying her. Even wrecked as she was, there was still beauty in her face. He smiled slightly, then bent down, licking his lips. She felt his hot breath on her face, willed herself not to react. He opened his mouth and ran his tongue across her face like a dog would. She didn't even blink. Her dull eyes seemed to see through him. Douglas grunted. Not much sport messing with a brain-dead loser. Not even a pretty one. She didn't blink an eye. Douglas hesitated a moment longer. Then he laughed and went out. The cell was shut and the lock snapped closed. Sarah could hear the sound of his nightstick tapping its way down the corridor, growing fainter. Sarah's eyes snapped into an alert intensity. She spat the paperclip out onto her chest, then groped for it, awkwardly spreading it open into a straight piece of wire. With slow, painful concentration, she moved it towards the lock of the restraints that bound her wrists to the bed. This is not an easy thing to do, but Sarah had taught herself a lot of things in her years of hiding. This was one of them. Handy for getting out of police cuffs. She never thought she'd have to break out of asylum restraints. With a final, agonizing twist, she managed to open the lock. She rapidly worked on the other wrist, all the while eyeing the cell window, just in case Douglas or the night watch should stroll by. 38 seconds later, Sarah sat up and released the Velcro straps on her ankles. She rolled off the bed and hit the floor a new person, almost feral in her movements. At the main gate, in the clean, blank confines of the pristine guard shack, the bored security guard glanced up. An LAPD black and white pulled up, its headlights blazing. He activated the barricade motor and nodded at the officer as he drove through onto the grounds. The cruiser pulled into a parking space next to Mossberg's unmarked car. The T-1000 got out, scanning the lot, and instantly determined the tactical possibilities with a surge of liquid awareness. This was the hub of the energies it was seeking. Here it would find the center of its existence, the termination of its target. It moved towards the main entrance of the hospital. Sarah was still in her cell, using the paperclip on the door lock. She wasn't moving in a panic now. She was calm, focused, intent on the lock. An echoing tapping sound distracted her. It was getting louder, coming her way. She went back to work on the lock, moving more quickly, but still with a steady hand. Douglas was tapping his stick along the wall, strolling down the dimly lit corridor. He carried a little maglite that he shined in the cell windows as he passed, barely slowing. There was no reason to make a more thorough check. All the patients were deep in Thorazine stupors, weakened, disorientated, near vegetables. Even Ms. Hardcase was tame tonight, Douglas thought, bemused. He rounded the corner, his footsteps echoing in the dark hallway. The tip of the stick hit the wall. Tap, tap, tap. He reached patient 82's cell and stopped, about to shine his light in. But his eye had caught something across the hall. A utility closet door was half open. Maintenance getting sloppy again. Douglas sighed and went to shut it, absently flicking his light into the dark closet. There was something strange among the buckets and cleaning supplies. A mop lay on the floor, its handle snapped off about halfway up. The other half was missing. Douglas pondered that for half a second, then heard a door open behind him and spun around. Sarah's cell door hung open. Before that thought could register fully, the missing 2 feet of mop handle filled his vision as it cracked viciously across the bridge of his nose. Sarah watched with great satisfaction as the 250 pounds of doughy attendant hit the floor with a resounding thud. She then expertly slammed the makeshift baton down across the back of his head, bouncing him off the linoleum. For Douglas, the world suddenly fell away for a while. He was in his own stupor now. Sarah dragged the limp body into her cell and locked him in with his own keys. Then she grabbed his heavy nightstick, hefting it like she knew how to use it better than the mop handle, laid back along her forearm, police style. She moved down the dark corridor, cat-stepping in her bare feet, definitely armed and dangerous. Past the main entrance doors, there was a long corridor that ended at a reception area, which was closed, and beyond that, a night receiving desk, which was behind a glass window where they could buzz you in through an adjacent heavy door. The night nurse, an ordinary-looking woman named Gwen, typed at a desk nearby. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw the young cop walking towards her. Compared to the others already inside, she thought this one was very nice-looking. She worked up her best smile. It had little effect on most men. The T-1000 wasn't very interested either. It spoke with a soft, pleasant voice designed to modulate the listener's subconscious resistance to strangers. "You have Sarah Connor here?" "Running late, aren't you? The others have been here some time." She turned to the inner door to buzz him in, but saw Silberman and the cops coming towards the door from the other side. "Ah, your friends are on the way out now," she said, turning back to the officer. But he was no longer standing there. Puzzled, she went to the counter and leaned out to see if he was at the drinking fountain. No. Reception was empty, and so was the long corridor beyond. She frowned, remembering the stories her cousin used to tell her about her policeman husband. Maybe all cops were that weird. Silberman came through the solenoid-operated door with Weatherby, Mossberg, the two uniformed cops, and a hospital security guard. As the latter retrieved his Browning 9mm pistol from a lockout box behind the night desk, Silberman faced him. "Lewis, see these gentlemen out and then lock up for the night." Lewis nodded deferentially and said, "Yes, sir." Silberman walked back through the door into the secure area of the hospital, while the cops walked down the long corridor to the entrance. Weatherby was mumbling, "That was productive." Mossberg added, "Yeah, I just love staying up all night." Lewis locked the entrance doors behind, then slowly walked back. The light at the night desk far ahead was like a sanctuary. His footsteps rang hollowly on the tile floor. His keys jingled. He was thinking of nothing in particular, idly noting the black and white checkerboard pattern of the floor tiling. As he passed one spot, it began to shiver and bulge upward like a liquid mass, still retaining the two-tone checkerboard of the tile. It hunched up, silently, into a quivering shadow in the darkness behind the guard. The night nurse had her back to her typewriter, working diligently on a report. The guard stopped at the coffee machine, punched out a selection, turned to the nurse. "Hey Gwen, you want some coffee?" "How about a beer?" she kidded. Lewis laughed and took his coffee cup from the machine. It was covered with drawings of playing cards, each with a different number, some kind of game. He squinted at the bottom of the cup, spilling the hot fluid, trying to read the game rules. "Hey, maybe it's my lucky day." Behind him, the fluid mass had reached a 6 feet height and began to resolve rapidly into a human figure. It lost the colour and texture of the tile and turned to the grey of the guard's uniform. The T-1000's mass had been spread out a quarter of an inch thick over several square yards of floor. When Lewis walked over it, his structure had been sampled in that instant. Now it was drawing in and pulling up to form a mirror image of the unwitting guard. The feet were the last of the liquid floor, pulling in to form shiny black guard shoes that detached with a faint sucking sound from the real floor as the T-1000 guard took its first step. The real guard whirled at the sound of footsteps to see himself. Not only someone who looked just like him, but someone wearing his uniform, complete with his name tag. He had one deeply disturbing moment to consider the ramifications of seeing oneself while working in the loon farm. Like maybe insanity was catching. Before he could even begin to clutch desperately at flimsy rationalizations to beat back the obvious impossibility standing before him, it raised its hand and pointed the right index finger directly at Lewis's face, only a too close foot away. In a split second, the finger speared out, elongating into a thin steel rod that snapped out like a stiletto, slashing into the guard's eye. It punched past the eyeball, a little like a transorbital lobotomy tool, and emerged from the back of the guard's skull. Life quietly drained from Lewis's face. He went from living being to meat in a matter of seconds. The rod finger suddenly retracted, snick. As the guard slumped, the T-1000 took his weight easily with one hand and walked him, as if carrying a suit on a hanger, back towards the night desk. The wounds were so tiny, no blood dripped onto the floor. The nurse glanced up as the T-1000 guard walked past, casually dragging something she couldn't see because it was below the countertop. "What you got, Lewis?" "Just some trash," he answered cheerfully. She nodded absently, disinterested. As she went back to typing, the T-1000 moved past, dragging the limp guard towards a closet door a few yards from the night receiving station. It removed the Browning 9mm pistol and the keys from the guard's belt, then stuffed the body into the utility closet. The T-1000 came back and glanced at the nurse. "All set," he said, with a smile. She glanced up and saw the pistol in his holster. "Gotta check the gun first, remember?" "Yeah, sorry." The T-1000 opened the locker and blocked it from her view with its body, then mimed putting the gun inside. Actually, it was inserting the pistol into its own chest, where the gun disappeared inside, as if dropped into a pot of hot fudge. As the T-1000 withdrew its hand, the chest was once again a surface that looked like cloth. Buttons and a name tag. The T-1000 slammed the locker door and waited as the nurse hit the button, unlocking the door with a buzz clack. The T-1000 went through. It moved through the halls, looking for the isolation ward. A few minutes later, it reached the isolation ward security checkpoint. The two bored attendants barely looked up as the T-1000 guard approached them. It glanced up at a chart near the door that indicated PNT-82 was in cell number 19. The T-1000 guard went into the isolation ward through the two doors, which locked behind it. The T-1000 passed the nurse's station, which looked like a cage, walled in by heavy metal mesh. Silberman, leaning in the open doorway, was talking to an attendant inside. He didn't even glance twice as Lewis passed by. Sarah, moving like a ghost in the darkened corridor, heard footsteps coming and quietly but quickly unlocked a cell next to hers with Douglas's master key. She slipped inside and waited as the footsteps passed. She glanced at the far side of the room. A wild-eyed female inmate, strapped tightly to the bed, watched her with a bird-like eye and quivering lips. Was she about to scream? Sarah hesitated, heart pounding, then grasped at a straw. She put a finger to her lips and said, "Shh." The inmate slowly nodded with a knowing expression. Sarah sighed with relief, then peered out of the cell window, seeing the black of the security guard as it turned a corner. She waited until she couldn't hear the footsteps. Then she moved. Silberman was yawning as he reviewed the medication allotments with the night attendant. It had been a long Saturday. He was contemplating sleeping in late on Sunday. Then he remembered that damn symposium on female violence which he had promised to lecture at. He was glancing at his watch, trying to remember when he was supposed to be there, when he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Sarah Connor slammed into him, hurling him through the door into the cage and following him in. The orderly jumped up, going for his stunner baton, but she nailed him first with Douglas's nightstick. His legs folded, and he did a great imitation of an inanimate object. Silberman lunged for the alarm button, but she cracked down hard on his arm. He cried out and grabbed his wrist. Sarah grabbed him by the hair and shoved him face down onto the desk, smacking him behind the knees expertly with the baton. His legs buckled, and he dropped to his knees with his chin on the desk. She pinned him with one hand. His expression was all outraged disbelief. "You broke my arm!" Sarah's voice was chilling to hear. "There's 215 bones in the human body, motherfucker. That's one. Now don't move." Moving rapidly, she whipped open a medication drawer and grabbed a syringe. She jammed it into the stunned attendant's butt and fired the whole shot. Still holding the empty syringe, she saw what she needed next. They kept the toxic cleaning supplies in the cage so the inmates wouldn't try drinking the Drano. She grabbed a plastic jug of liquid plumber, then slammed it down on the desk, inches from Silberman's eyes. She jabbed the empty syringe into the plastic jug and drew back the plunger. His horrified eyes racked towards the 15 cc's of blue death filling the cylinder. What are you going to do?" he gasped. She removed the needle and jammed it into Silberman's neck. Her thumb hovered over the plunger. Jerking him to his feet by the collar, she got a tight grip on him, then hauled him through the door. The T-1000 stopped outside cell number 19 and looked in the window. Douglas, his face a bloody mess, yelled to be heard through the soundproofed door. The T-1000 didn't have to hear. It could read lips. "Open the door! The goddamn bitch is loose in the halls!" Douglas was shouting. To his amazement, the guard impassively turned and walked away, leaving him inside, face pressed to the glass, furious. Outside, the Terminator and John were approaching the guard gate on the Harley. The cycle pulled over and stopped nearby. The noise of the big engine idling caused the guard to look up. John said, "Now remember, you're not going to kill anyone, right?" Just the slightest hesitation before the cyborg answered, "Right." John was not convinced. "Swear." "What?" "Just say, 'I swear I won't kill anyone.'" John held his hand up like he was being sworn in. The Terminator stared at John for a moment, running all the possibilities through his wafer circuit brain. There was nothing in there that covered this human gesture. Uncertain of its usefulness, the Terminator mimicked the gesture, then said, "I swear I will not kill anybody." Then the Terminator slid off the cycle and walked towards the gate. The guard, sensing trouble, had his gun drawn as he came out of the shack. The Terminator continued towards him, his scanners rapidly checking all the lethal strike zones in the human anatomy and excluding them as target factors, then extrapolating where the non-lethal ones were. He smoothly drew his .45 and shot the guard with surgical accuracy, twice in the knees. The guy dropped, screaming and clutching his legs. John couldn't believe his eyes. "What the hell are you doing?" The Terminator kicked the guard's gun away, then smashed the phone in the shack with his fist. He pushed the button to raise the gate and walked back to the Harley. He read consternation on John's face and said, "He'll live." The Terminator climbed on the cycle and released the clutch. They moved through the gate and headed down an ambulance ramp into an underground emergency receiving area. John turned back and yelled at the groaning guard. "Sorry, mister!"